Good morning, good afternoon. Hello, and welcome to the Urban Century, Climate Change and Local Action in the Americas, and perhaps beyond. A discussion co-hosted by Carnegie, California, and Carnegie's Sustainability, Climate, and Geopolitics program. Before we start, a quick word on Carnegie's new West Coast shop. What happens in California matters to the world, and what happens in the world matters to California. These simple truths reflect California's scale, in part, but just as importantly, its connections. And while they may seem obvious, these truths result from histories of migration, technological development, geological disruption, and policy innovation, and from bi-directional and circular processes that, while at times contested and evident, are no means always self-evident. Carnegie, California is here to bring those connections into relief and, where appropriate, to shape them. We have a group of non-resident scholars and scholars who are now here, including one, I think, who's joining us in the audience and perhaps for discussion, Mark Baldassare, one of the great policy minds in California. But today, we are exploring those connections in the form of links between cities and urban areas and the climate crisis. By any measure, demographics, land cover, emissions, economic growth, we are living in an urban century. But scale doesn't translate into policy, let alone good policy or policy impact. Over the last decade, we have seen a conscious effort by cities as actors to develop influence on the global stage. An outgrowth of this movement being the upcoming Cities Summit of the Americas in Denver next week. But this movement has been propelled by cities demonstrating relevance and delivering impact on the ground, whether it be evolving the urban built environment through tactical urbanism or nature-based solutions, or divesting from fossil fuels. The commitments and actions of cities that cut emissions and prepare for a warmer future often, most often, outpace nation states. Carnegie is very lucky to have the Wunderkind Noah Gordon co-helming its program on sustainability, climate, and geopolitics. And we are also incredibly lucky to have him today moderating discussion with three unique experts. Erin, Rit, and Carlos, for those of you who are joining us, have expertise in everything from the SDGs to urban planning to the private sector and technology in urban spaces, as well as city networks. I can't imagine a better group to be talking about localized action in the context of a global challenge. Over to you, Noah. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ian, for the kind introduction. And before I fully introduce our esteemed guests, I want to frame the discussion by focusing on one, climate impact and how local action matters. I've got a few slides here, just three, from the Summary for Urban Policymakers, which synthesizes IPCC climate science and says what it means for cities and urban areas. Ian was a series editor for those reports. So this first slide is up. Let's talk about heat. As we know, land surfaces warm faster than the planet as a whole, and that warming is also uneven. Globally, temperatures are up by 1.1, about 1.2 degrees, but certain cities have already warmed much more than that. Unfortunately, those cities were already quite warm. You can see on the slide, Porto is up by 1.6 degrees Celsius, Tehran by 2.3, and Kolkata by 2.6. So the heat is much more severe in those areas. On the next slide, we see some of the things that cities can do to make the temperature cooler or warmer. I mean, you see that water and vegetation matters. The city layout matters. Those are some, so there's adaptation that can be done here. And finally, as a final slide, from the SUP report is what to do about heat risk. You see there's hazard reduction, exposure reduction, and vulnerability reduction. So exposure reduction is things like more green public spaces, changing the times people work outdoors, active and passive cooling, early warning systems. You know, our conversation will be much broader than this, but the most direct impact of global heating is, of course, extreme heat. So let's bring in the experts now and give them the full introduction. We have Erin Bromaghim, who serves as Deputy Mayor of International Affairs for the Office of the Mayor of Los Angeles, Karen Bass. She was previously Director of Olympic and Paralympic Development for Los Angeles. And Erin is also a Senior Visiting Fellow on City and State Diplomacy at the Truman Center for National Security. There on the bottom of the screen, we have Carlos Moreno, an associate professor at the University Paris 1 Panthéon-Sorbonne, and the scientific director and co-founder of the ETI chair. That's for Entrepreneurship, Territory, and Innovation. Carlos is an international expert of the human smart city and has been a driving force behind Paris's 15-minute city plan. Joining us later is Rohit Aggarwala, the commissioner of New York City's environmental protection, but I'll introduce him more when he's here. Let's get right into it. Carlos, you've been in the news even more than usual recently. Can you tell the audience about the concept of the 15-minute city and the recent deranged backlash to the idea?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for this kind invitation. Greeting from Paris, from everyone. The 15-minute city concept is a concept based on how could we develop cities today with the radical transformation of our urban life in order to fight against climate change. This is the first motivation for proposing this way. For that, we need to transform our urban lifestyle from a zoning based on long distances, the extensive use of the individual cars to cut off the car dependency, fossil energies, and to promote a polycentric city with the multi-services city, with the different paradigm for developing more local economy, local jobs, local activities, multi-purpose functions to use and reuse the buildings that existed today instead of to continue to use in a single functions. In put it in a nutshell, we wanted to promote a more happy proximity in all city, fight against the segmented, fractured zoned city, and develop more social interactions, more public spaces for all, a more intensive local neighborhood with more economic vitality. This is a concept developed for 13 years and since February recently, we have observed the emergence of the alt-right in particular for developing this conspiracy mongers global movement because they wanted to transform the 15-minute city concept in a kind of climate lockdown, insanity way. But this is a fake manipulations and real insanity.
Yeah, you noted the recent controversy, and there have been protests in Oxford against the idea of a 15-minute city, people claiming that this is somehow a Stalinist plot or that cameras are tracking you, but it's really about being able to safely bike to the doctor's office or for your kids to walk to school. Just a quick follow-up, Carlos. What role do city networks or partnerships between cities help play in spreading ideas like the 15-minute city? How does Paris work with other cities to push this agenda?
Yes, at the beginning of this concept, the role of the network of cities was essential. In fact, this concept was embraced by the mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo, in 2018 for proposing this concept in the electoral campaign in 2020 for the municipal elections. We had in our planet in 2020 in March the impact of the COVID-19. The global network of cities for fighting against climate change, the C40 cities, has adopted this concept in July 2020 for proposing a new trajectory in order to reconcile this decarbonized way in cities for fighting against climate change, to reduce our CO2 footprint, to propose an economical and social interactive way for recovering from the COVID-19 and their consequences. And the global network of C40 cities has proposed to spread this concept in all continents, in all cities. You have less than 1 billion people in less than 100 cities, members of the C40 cities. The significant point is our capability for proposing this 50-minute city concept in order to be customized in different continents, in different cities, in the different social, cultural, economical, political, including religious contexts, with this way for adapting in the local conditions. We have UN Habitat, United Nations, which has adapted this concept as well. And after the main international organization of mayors. The role of the global network of cities is a strategic role for fighting against the global conspiracy movement, because this is movement that use the social networks, Twitter, Facebook, or TikTok, but the real life is the real life managed by the mayors present in the different social organizations of mayors. And we have a total support for continuing to implement this concept in everywhere around the world.
No, thanks, Carlos. The transformation of Paris under Mayor Anne Hidalgo has been remarkable. It's starting to look less like car-friendly Brussels and more like bike-friendly Amsterdam. And it's also a reminder that cities control such important levers for climate policy, like bike lanes and zoning. Erin, Los Angeles is not famous for being an especially walkable or bikeable city, but it's improving. Can you tell us about your efforts to make LA more sustainable and resilient ahead of the 2028 Olympics and Paralympics?
I can. Thank you, Noah, for a great question. And thank you to Carnegie for including me in this conversation. It's an honor to be here with Dr. Moreno and all of you. It's a question that I could really answer for hours, and I'll just start by drawing a quick distinction between what we're doing to make Los Angeles as a city more sustainable and resilient from what the games themselves will do to create, hopefully, the world's most sustainable mega event ever in 2028. But as a city, what we're thinking about is really how sustainability informs our infrastructure investments, and conversely, how infrastructure can be informed by these sustainability investments. And we have existing commitments in place that have started really before the games were a real plan for us in 2028, like going back to really, I would say even in early 2000s, starting to build on the city's plans for more trees and more public green space and more walkability. And then we've seen major investments in public transit infrastructure, starting with Measure M in 2016, where voters in Los Angeles County approved a measure to begin building 15 new rail lines throughout the city. These types of major infrastructure investments are a big part of our overall sustainability footprint and where we want to go. And then we also have the key policy levers, as you mentioned, and some of those are really found in what we call LA's Green New Deal. That includes 5 major commitments to zero carbon. That includes a zero carbon grid, zero carbon in our built environment, moving to zero carbon transportation, zero waste, and zero wasted water. And those 5 zeros are a key part of where we're planning to be and to be on the road to through 2028, including major investments in shade infrastructure, as well as new trees and more walkability, to your point on that connectivity. But specifically for the games themselves, what we've started to look at as well is how we can embrace hyper-local connectivity when we think about some of the key venues and access between where kind of the city's infrastructure and public transportation will connect to some of the major events or the major tourist destinations that'll be a part of the mega events coming to Los Angeles, including the games. And that looks like being able to assess and really audit the walkability and the connectivity between some of these key points, understanding more about how folks with different levels of accessibility, right? So people with disabilities, as we aim to host the first ever Paralympic Games in Los Angeles, even though it'll be the 3rd time we're hosting the Summer Olympic Games, first time for the Paralympic Games. And so really focusing on different ways of approaching kind of our surface infrastructure and making sure that connectivity exists for everybody is a key part. We want to leave no one behind in the process of ensuring that we have a more walkable, more accessible, more sustainable, and more resilient city.
I like that you mentioned leaving no one behind. I think critics of improving walkability and connectivity sometimes maybe overlook that there are exceptions for some people will always be able to use personal motor vehicles. We are keeping taxis and things for people who may not be able to easily bike. And the transformation sounds great. I need to get my tickets for 2028 when it's time. Erin, a follow-up for you. I mean, your job involves a lot of political work, but what role does the science from IPCC reports or the Summary for Urban Policymakers play for you? Like, how do you take that and bring it to a local council meeting or persuade a neighborhood to change the way it looks?
This is another great question, and I just want to start by highlighting that Mayor Bass had her first State of the City speech address really on Monday night. And as a part of that speech, she mentioned the fact that something that she found that I know I found in kind of transitioning from working in federal government and working in Washington to working at the local level here in Los Angeles is that both science and climate change are real here. We don't have to debate that point the way that we so often see that debate playing out in national conversations or national politics. And climate, I think, has kind of become for local politicians something like national security might have been for national politicians in kind of past years, where we all agree and are all committed to continuing the good work that administrations have done across those transitions. And so the work that I would say Mayor Villaraigosa started, continued, and was embraced and grown by Mayor Garcetti, and now Mayor Bass is doing the same, is recognizing that these are long commitments, right? Things that are going to take time to realize. And it's important to maintain the momentum and accelerate where we can. So I'd say persuading the stakeholders that climate change is real and using science to do that can be a key part of the argument that we make, but we're not arguing about that as much as we are about where those trade-offs exist. And so I think when we work really closely with other partners, it becomes a question of how do we understand the kind of cost benefit of some of these key transitions. So when we look at how we go about these big changes and achieving the 5 zeros, right? How do we make that a just transition so that it embraces and can transition all of the folks that'll be impacted throughout the process, right? When we look at the fossil fuel supply chain in Los Angeles, from extraction through refining all the way to gas stations, like who's impacted by that, and how do we get our arms around ways that we can make that transition just and equitable for everybody involved? So I think when we look at things like what we did with the National Renewable Energies Lab, this was it's called the California 100 study, and we looked at how LA's DWP can migrate to a zero carbon grid over, and kind of what those various pathways were. And the 4 pathways that they articulated with hundreds of millions of kind of modeling and simulation runs, right, ended up looking at these various ways that you can do that, various timelines to accelerate that, and various trade-offs along the way. And that's really where our conversation is not that we need to do this, but that how we're going to do it, and how we're going to do it in a way that doesn't disproportionately impact our most vulnerable communities.
Very encouraging, and I'll have more for you on the 5 zeros and LA's goals in a minute. Dr. Moreno, you were born in Colombia, but you live in Paris now, which, like many European cities, is denser and more walkable than many megacities in the Americas. Ahead of this city summit of the Americas, how would you assess or compare local level climate action in the Americas as compared to Europe? Are there lessons that can be taken across the Atlantic?
Yes, it's not always easy to compare the different actions in the 2 continents, in Americas, North America, South America. You're right. I was born in Colombia. I'm living in France for 44 years now, even if South America is my continent at the origin. I want to say 3 points. The first one, we are totally inspired in Europe by this idea of sustainability. Is in reality 3 values: zero carbon, zero poverty, and zero exclusions. I want to say that if we wanted to fight with a great success against climate change, this is not only a question of a technological impact for reducing our CO2 footprint, but we needed to consider at the same time that it is not possible to access to climate justice without a more economical justice and social justice. We need, in reality, to offer for our cities, for citizen dwellers, this convergence for having more cities with the ecological livability, economical viability, and positive social impact with more inclusion. I think that in Europe, this is today a very, very strong point to develop an action for climate is at the same time to develop more local economy, more local jobs, more social inclusion. What is the impact of this triple way in cities? We need for that to change our urban lifestyle. We consider that in Europe, our urban lifestyle is unsustainable because for a long time, we have defined an urban lifestyle based on long distances, in a so important segregations, fractured city, segmented city. I am convinced that in Europe today, we have decided to develop another model opposed to the heritage of Le Corbusier, the long distances, with a new vice, the addiction of individual car, the car dependency. If we want to maybe to compare with North America, 2 hours ago, I delivered an interview to Radio Canada. I said one of the most significant differences in America versus Europe is this change in the urban life for avoiding the urban sprawl. The urban sprawl is a real significant difference. The urban sprawl is unsustainable. The urban sprawl, it is a situation with a paradox, because we want to the urban sprawl to continue to foster people for living in the individual homes, to have this strong car dependency. At the same time, people wanted to have local services, medical services, schools, shops, but it is not possible. And on the other hand, we have a more isolated urban life, and to pay less taxes. This is a total contradiction, because the intersections in these three needs is the empty intersection. It is not possible to reconcile less taxes, lot of services, the individual home in an sprawl urbanization. This is an important difference, because we have in Europe a mindset more open for living in a more compact cities, for fighting against these strong urbanizations, and to promote more social interaction. Our difficulty in the European cities, in fact, was to be accepted for a long time the corporate business district with these single functions of building infrastructures, because we had implementing a lot of different corporate building with the long distances from the residential areas. Today, with the 50-minute city, with the 30-minute territory, with the shorter distances in a polycentric and multi-services way, we have proposed to return to the model of the humanistic European urbanism, based on polycentrism, to fight against these zonifications, to offer a new reason for living in the city, the chrono-urbanism, for using more and better the building with the multi-purpose functions, the chronotopia, and for developing a more intensive urban culture, for taking public spaces as a vector for more democracy, more mixity, a more urban culture. I think that we need to, between Europe and America, discuss of the role of this strong urbanization and car dependency. And in my opinion, in America, we need to start a more important long journey for breaking this car dependency.
Agreed. I think that's well said, and I like your phrase, humanistic European urbanism. I myself just moved from Berlin back to Washington, D.C., which is a relatively dense city in the U.S., but Berlin's reliance on the U-Bahn and S-Bahn compares favorably to the American dream of 2 cars in a garage.
Yes.
Erin, you're also the Conrad and Hilton Foundation Fellow, and I know you're tracking Los Angeles' progress towards the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Can you give us some real-world examples? You know, Carlos was talking about economic viability as well as making cities more resilient and sustainable. Can you give us some real-world examples of what climate scientists call co-benefits? Like, how can taking local climate action get Los Angeles towards the SDGs or vice versa?
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, SDGs I think are incredibly important, and when we look at the structure of the 17 goals and the 169 targets and 250 something indicators, right? They're not all created equal. And one of the things that the professor mentioned is kind of the connectivity and tensions that exist. And so as we were doing our work to identify data sources and track and kind of revise even the language of the SDG targets to better reflect the context of Los Angeles, one of the things that we found is that some of these indicators are what I would start calling sticky indicators. Like they have backward and forward linkages and a ton of externalities that really matter. And so they're heavily both dependent on other inputs as well as, impactful in terms of trackers, right? So they become kind of these super trend indicators. And one of those I'd point to is SDG 8.6, which focuses on what we in Los Angeles call opportunity youth, or young people who are neither in school or employed between the ages of 16 and 24. And what you can find when you look at this indicator is kind of where pockets exist throughout our city, both geographically and demographically, where folks are impacted by kind of not being enrolled in school or working, right? And so this is one of those kind of indicators where if you can directly address this population, you have a tremendous impact on other related externalities, everything from kind of how folks are finding employment and access to education and other outcomes that drive kind of countering poverty, ending hunger, right, addressing some of our climate priorities. So I think when you're talking to me too, as a kid who grew up in LA, right, we look at the change that has happened in my lifetime with air quality. And air quality is another one of those very kind of sticky targets, right, where you have kind of the ability to address multiple issues if you address or focus at least in on this one issue. And so I think you can say, like, when we in California, enacted our vehicle emission standards changes in the 90s, right? You have now decades of progress towards cleaning the air. And yet we still have tremendously dirty air in Los Angeles. Just this week, we got an F rating on our air quality. So there's a lot of work still yet to be done, but this becomes incredibly connected to other things like health outcomes, asthma in young people, right? How people experience like kind of crowding in and around kind of some of our major freeways, right? How does that intersect with our priorities around economic development and port operations and having the largest port complex in the Western Hemisphere? So these are some areas where like these kind of connective, sticky indicators that we find in the SDGs become a key indicator of where you could potentially take action and identify co-benefits in addressing both climate as well as overall sustainability objectives. And I just want to hit the fact that I don't think sustainability can continue to exist in some of the ways that we've been treating it as this kind of environmental only lane of operations, right? To what Dr. Moreno said as well, sustainability, a sustainable community is one that is more equitable, that has access to the social services that it needs, has, rates of education and employment, access to food services. This is not just an environmental challenge or an infrastructure challenge, but one about truly achieving social justice.
I'm glad you brought up air quality, air pollution, and the health impacts. I mean, that's the most direct impact of burning coal or oil or biomass is that these tiny particles that are in the air and are really dangerous for humans. I recently got an air filter for my house. It's actually in the kitchen here, probably not too loud. And seeing when the dot goes red makes you realize how often you are breathing those things in. And the numbers about deaths from air pollution are really scary. We're about to bring in Rit, but I mean, while I have the two of you here, we're talking a lot about networks of cities like C40 today. I wonder if either of you has a question for the other, maybe a question from LA to Paris or from Paris to LA. I'm putting you on the spot, but maybe there's something.
Well, Doctor, I'd love to know if you, outside of the European context, where you see the greatest potential for a 15-minute city.
Answer?
Sorry, I was just going to ask you if you think outside of Europe, if there's any cities outside of Europe that might be on their way to achieving that 15-minute city goal.
I think that the 15-minute city is this is an European way, and today this is the universal way for redefining the quality of life in cities, for offering more local service, another work style as well, and to redefine the access to the essential services as medical services, education, culture, supplying the shorter circuits with the raw materials, and to offer more public spaces for having a more friendly life, and to go beyond the only ecological measures for offering this high quality societal urban life.
I would just jump in and say, you know, part of my remit as Deputy Mayor of International is to look at international trade and investment. And we talk a lot with companies. And in the post-COVID context, fewer and fewer companies that we talk to about potentially setting up shop in a city like Los Angeles, fewer of them are interested in a major headquarters, and they're interested much more in looking at kind of hubs, right, throughout
Yes.
a given urban area, right? So setting up multiple, almost a polycentric approach to their corporate operations, tapping into the talent that exists across the kind of expanse of the urban area, at least in the context of LA, that we have here. And I think that that's an interesting parallel to what we're trying to achieve in terms of urban infrastructure and the development, is how are we kind of all moving across multiple sectors, private, nonprofit, right, to kind of a more polycentric approach to urbanism.
Yeah, I agree totally.
Erin, you've got, your city has a big green partnership with one of the biggest cities in China. Can you tell us about the Los Angeles-Shanghai green shipping corridor, and is that a model that could be expanded?
I mean, we certainly hope so, because in addition to working with Shanghai, we've also committed to working with Singapore, as well as working with two cities in Japan, for Tokyo and Yokohama. So in these 4 green shipping corridors, we're kind of hoping that collectively the work that we do on each of them will push the market to a tipping point where we can actually advance the state of, what we need, which is a clean ship operating on these corridors, and then greening operations across the entire port complex in both directions, right? So the entire life cycle, if you will, is green, but that includes really starting with kind of all the way across the ship's operations, ensuring that that becomes a totally green reality. But there are a lot of considerations along the way, not the least of which, again, is in that kind of context of trade-offs with cost and labor, and making sure that we do it in a just and equitable way that creates a truly sustainable market as we move to a zero carbon shipping future.
Gotcha.
Just to one point, in the European Union, we have 27 countries, very, very different countries. The European Union has defined a common green policy based on the Green Deal. The Green Deal is the common policy for reducing our CO2 emissions. In the European cities, the Green Deal is called the New European Bauhaus. In last September 2022, for the first time, the European Union has launched a new program called Driving Urban Transitions, in order to promote this polycentric, multi-service and proximity model for transforming our urban lifestyle, our work lifestyle, and to develop more local services in the different contexts of the European cities. Of course, Berlin is very different to Paris, to Madrid, to Barcelona, to Rome, to Milano. But the common point in each one of these cities is their commitment for developing this new happy proximity urban agenda. For that, this is very interesting to have an access for exchanging and to discuss in a new common activity for nourishing our different experiences and practice. In Barcelona, the name is the Superblock. In Roma, this is the Città, the happy proximity for my city. We have a lot of different nicknames, but at the same time, the common basis is the same, a polycentric, multi-service, green, for more prosperity for cities and dwellers, with local services in a proximity for all cities. Our common enemy is the gentrification. Our common enemy is the private interest for developing the local districts for people with the high income revenues, rather than to develop this urban policy as a common urban policy in the general interest. This is very important to fight against gentrification and to propose more local services for all cities as a common public service.
Thanks, Carlos. I want to come back in a minute to how cities can learn from one another, but let's bring in our third expert. Joining us now on screen is Rohit Aggarwala, the Commission of the New York City's Environmental Protection. He led the creation of the Mayor's Office of Long-Term Planning and Sustainability under Mayor Michael Bloomberg, founded the Environmental Grant-Making Program at Bloomberg Philanthropies, and served as president of the board of directors of the C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group. Thanks for joining us, Rohit.
Thanks for having me, and apologies for having to join late.
No problem at all. I want to ask first question being about your title. You're the Chief Climate Officer for New York City. What is your job, and when did megacities like New York start having chief climate or environmental officers?
Well, I think the titles have changed over time, in part as the work has gotten bigger and more established. My first role with New York City, my title was Director of Long-Term Planning and Sustainability, which was effectively Chief Climate Officer at the time. And that was in 2006 that I joined. At about the same time, certainly in the United States and in Europe, you had a couple of cities that started having sustainability leads, and the titles varied. Chicago, I think, might have been the first to have appointed a chief environmental officer, but the roles, generally speaking, were pretty similar. It was a cross-cutting policy role to figure out how to leverage climate across city agencies. And as you all well know, one of the challenges with climate is it is so interdisciplinary that buildings and transportation and waste and education and energy supply and all sorts of things that are usually housed in very different parts of government have to have a common approach and a coordinated approach to climate. I think over time, what we've seen in the last few years, I think a number more cities have kind of, frankly, somebody like me with a more grandiose title of trying to say the same thing, which is Chief Climate Coordinator of some sort. And in part, I think that reflects the positive development that in more and more cities, there's a much more articulated set of institutions working on this. So, again, in contrast to when I joined the Bloomberg administration 16, 17 years ago, it was, me, and then I hired a handful of other people. Now we have the evolution of that office, which is the Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice, that has, 40 or 50 people. But even more importantly, we have 20 city agencies. New York has 52 city agencies, but we have 20 city agencies that all have a deputy commissioner for sustainability or somebody with a comparable title. And so my role is no longer just running one office and there's an executive director of that office, but my role is really to make sure that all of the work that's already going on across city agencies is pulling in the same direction, being mutually reinforcing, so on and so forth. And again, I think you see that same evolution in many cities where they realize that climate policy is not just one think tank, right? It's not one policy center. It requires a lot of different agencies. And I'll just finish by saying one of the things I think that we've innovated on here in the Adams administration, which we're not necessarily the first, but I'm not sure if there are others right now, where I actually have two jobs. So as Chief Climate Officer, I have a citywide policy responsibility around climate. But I'm also Commissioner of the Department of Environmental Protection, which is New York City's water utility, as well as our environmental enforcement entity, right? And so I have a combination of a cross-cutting policy and a highly vertically integrated operations role. And again, I think at various points due to individuals, we've seen that in a couple of other cities. But to my mind, that reflects the extent to which climate action is no longer about policy making. Climate action is about implementation and delivery.
And when it comes to implementation on the local level, the more, the merrier. Rit, we started with an infographic on urban temperature rise, and we all know how hot it can get in Manhattan in the summer. More and more cities, we're talking about titles again, are getting chief heat officers. I mean, in the Americas, Santiago, Monterey, I know Los Angeles has one, Erin. New York has a rat czar that's been in the news. Does it have a dedicated chief heat officer? Or maybe you can say a word about heat specifically and how the Adams administration is helping New York adapt to higher temperatures.
Well, so certainly heat is top of mind. We've chosen at the moment not to create a chief heat officer just because, frankly, we didn't see the need for it. We have an office, this mayor's office of climate and environmental justice, and what we've been doing in that office is integrating multiple aspects of both resilience and climate mitigation into the same actions. And I think that's one of the things that we find, buildings that need to do energy efficiency, they also need to become more resilient, right? And that's resilient to flooding. We've got so many buildings in New York City, particularly low-income housing, that do not have air conditioning. They're going to have to put air conditioning in. In fact, just today, we earlier today released the 5th version of Plan YC of New York City's sustainability plan. With Mayor Adams, and one of the things we have committed to doing is working towards a maximum indoor temperature for residential space. Like most cities, New York City has a law that says landlords have to keep interior living spaces above a certain temperature. We don't have a law that says you have to keep it below a certain temperature. And I think the reality is we're going to have to move towards something like that. It's going to be a huge effort because that effectively involves retrofitting buildings with air conditioners or preferably heat pumps. But if we do that in conjunction with the existing local law 97 that we have here in New York, that's going to require a lot of those same buildings to electrify, they're presumably going to heat pumps anyway. And so again, I think to my mind, that's an example of how you can have both your mitigation and your resilience strategies take place at the same time.
That's a really interesting policy approach. I mean, this is anecdotal, but I do hear stories here in DC of landlords or buildings who refuse to turn on their air conditioners maybe until June. But if you have a day in May where it's 90 degrees Fahrenheit, that's not going to be okay for vulnerable people.
100%. Can I just give you an anecdote?
Yeah, please.
Just last week, we had 2 90-degree days in New York City in April. DEP's headquarters, our lease with our landlord does not require them to turn on the air conditioner until the middle of May. We hit indoor maximum temperatures that under our union contracts, we had to send everybody in the agency home.
Wow. That is a great climate change story and a scary one. This is sort of a question for the whole group. I wonder if any of you could speak to the division of labor between cities and US states or the federal government. When the US government or maybe the EU Commission or the French government sets a target for emissions or the share of electric vehicles sold, what can a city like LA, New York, Paris do to make that possible? Like, what does a city need from the federal or state government to achieve its climate goals, and what are the limits of municipal power? So sort of a tripartite question, but for anyone in the group about the interplay between different levels of policymaking.
Yes.
Well, I can just jump in and say, I mean, I think cities and to a certain extent states, and particularly when we look at a city like Los Angeles and County of Los Angeles, the County of Los Angeles is larger than 41 states by population. So what we have to rely on is our ability to move markets while being resource constrained, right? So we are resource constrained market movers. And we've seen that happen in California, when we look at kind of vehicle emission standards and other ways of regulating what happens within our given kind of market, right, of 40 million people in California, and particularly within Los Angeles and the space that we have. So I think, we become market movers, right, as much as we can within some of these long-term goals. I think what you're addressing or what you're pointing to is a need that we have kind of collectively to talk about how we have our distribution of resources catch up with the reality that urban spaces now face, that local governments now face, right? Which is, how do we ensure that we have adequate access to resources, not just federal resources, but actual market capital, right, that can enable us to realize these transitions that are a part of our collective goals for the future. And I think this is some of what I'm looking for at the City Summit as well, is really that focus on, when we look across the hemisphere, right, when we can look in the American context about our ability to access market capital in major cities, but not all cities have access to financial mechanisms. Not all cities can achieve or access the investment that they need to be able to execute these transitions in a sustainable way. And I think this is a big topic of conversation where we need to go in this, is not just a real conversation about our federalism, but a real conversation about the limits of what cities can achieve without finding more new and creative ways of changing some of these nationally driven systems that have existed over the last 100 years.
Really interesting. I think resource-constrained market movers is too long to fit on a license plate, but it's something to be proud of, and maybe a new tagline for LA. I have another one for Rip. Carlos, is there anything you'd like to say about on the EU side about when Paris wants to implement a new policy? Are there sometimes conflict with the French government or with Brussels?
Yes. I'm going to talk about Paris in particular, and how proximity, in fact, with Anne Hidalgo is a strong policy in face of climate change, and in particular, a strategic point. We consider that we don't have a choice today. We need to shift our urban lifestyle. I remember that George Bush's father, when he refused to ratify the Kyoto Protocol, said the American way of life is not negotiable. I think that our European and French and Parisian way of life is not only negotiable, but we have started a journey for changing radically this way of life. The mayor of Paris said, for fighting against climate change, we need to develop more economic justice and social justice, I said a few minutes ago. But for implementing this way, for developing this mitigation, because the climate change is irreversible, we need to reduce the zone of risk. The mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo, has proposed with the 15-minute city with the proximity 4 pillars. The first one, ecology, transforming our daily attitude for offering another way for reducing our CO2 footprint. With more proximity, this is the second point, we could transform our daily long commute for more pedestrianized mobility, for more bike capability. We have exceeded in Paris 1,200 kilometers of bike-capable protected lanes. We have today the possibility for crossing Paris east, west, north, south, diagonal, just in a bike without cross a car, because we have the protected lane. But this is not enough to develop this decarbonized mobility. We need to promote proximity with the local jobs, with the local commerce, with the local shops. For the city of Paris, we have developed the commercial property of the city of Paris for offering in all city different locations for renting with a price below the price of the speculative real estate market, for hosting hosting artisans, for hosting libraries, recycling points, etc. And we need to develop as well more interactions in the public space, more solidarity. Solidarity for developing more gender equity, for take care of fragile people, for offering more medical services, for the mental and physical health. Today, the climate anxiety is one of the most important problems for young people.
Mm-hmm.
And the fourth point, we need to increase the citizen participation. For that, we have developed different tools. The participatory budget, for example, the program Beautify Mon District, in order to propose with the citizen dwellers in the different districts, lot of projects co-founded by the city in order to develop the concrete local adaptation for climate change, vegetalizations, more urban agriculture, more vegetalizations in gardens, etc. Ecology, proximity, solidarity, and city participation based as a common good in a Parisian public urban policy is the part of this urban way for a more resilient city in face with climate change, poverty, and social exclusions.
Thank you, Carlos. Rit, I think the American way of life that George H.W. Bush was talking about was maybe not the way people live in New York, where urban mobility is a bit different.
Yes.
I wonder if you can say anything about the role of technology in enabling mobility. I mean, there's ride sharing and scooters, e-bikes, and smart chargers. There's a lot of overlap between improving technology and enhancing sustainable mobility. What is that like for you in New York?
Technology, certainly there's a lot that technology has already done to change urban mobility. Some of it's very good. Some of it, has not been all that good, right? And we certainly in New York have seen it's a little bit different now in the post-pandemic era and with changes in the ride-hail market. But you think of ride-hailing and Uber and Lyft and the explosion of those in the last decade. In some parts of New York City, I would argue the provision, the availability of those ride-hail services were helpful in helping people who live in higher or medium density parts of New York City to maintain a car-free lifestyle, right? But it is also the case that those same ride-hail services led to significantly increased congestion in the highest density parts in Manhattan and the innermost parts of Brooklyn and Queens. And so it was a bit of a double-edged sword. It's a similar case on e-bikes. New York is probably the place with the highest concentration of e-bikes in North America. Most of our delivery services of food and other things are now delivered by deliveristas on e-bikes. And that's been great. On the other hand, we have had a proliferation of fires related to the unregulated batteries. I mean, I actually don't know the number off the top of my head, but I think it's at least 6, if not more, New Yorkers have died this calendar year in fires caused by e-bikes. And so one of our challenges is we have to figure out how to transition that industry without killing it. We don't want to outlaw e-bikes, right? But we've got to transition it to be much more safety conscious and to a certain extent, probably more heavily regulated. And then the final thing I'll say, again, it's a double-edged sword, is that one of the best aspects of technology for transportation is enforcement. All right. We've seen most places that have tolling systems have shifted to electronic tolling over the last 15 years. That's been phenomenally beneficial in terms of enabling more tolling and reducing the congestion associated with it. We now have the largest network of speed cameras and red light cameras in the United States here in New York. We issue, I believe it's over $1 million a day in tickets from those cameras. We've seen very clear improvements in behavior among drivers when we implement those speed cameras. At the same time, what we are seeing is an increase in the number of defaced plates. And so people are actively covering up their license plates in order to avoid camera-based tolling and camera-based enforcement. And that's going to require a response from the city and the state.
No, the defaced plates are worrying. I know Matt Iglesias is on a one-man crusade in DC to stop that. And also the thing about e-bike batteries being dangerous. That's exactly the type of thing you have to stop, because car drivers point to fatalities from those, and even while they fail to compare them to the number of people who die in motor vehicle accidents. We only have a few minutes left, so I'm going to do a final lightning round and look ahead to the City Summit of the Americas that we're here to talk about today. What do you hope for from the summit? What do you expect? I want to start with Erin.
Well, thanks. I mean, I hopefully more city summits, right? Like we hope that it's successful enough that, and there's enough kind of quality conversation and content and value add for the participants and for what comes from these connections. We have to kind of take a step back, I think, and realize that there aren't that many spaces where mayors have the opportunity to come together and collectively talk through some of these key areas that affect cities on a regular basis, right? And this is an opportunity, this is a new platform for them to do that. So fundamentally, while I have a lot of hopes and goals for policy outcomes that may come from the conversations that are had therein, and then trying to advance some of the narratives around things I raised, like financing at the subnational level, I think fundamentally more summits would be would be the win.
Hopefully the first of many. Carlos, a final word from you, either on the City Summit or otherwise.
Yes, my dream is to have a strong commitment of local governance in Americas, in all Americas, for developing ambitious roadmap based on these 4 items: ecology, proximity, solidarity, citizen participation. I am convinced that with the international cooperation, with the Global Network for Cities, with the C40 cities, we have today the possibility for developing the concrete transformations, the pilots. For example, we have, I had this morning a meeting with the 150 students worldwide with the C40 cities, just for a change. How could we transform concretely our different cities around the world? In Americas, we have today this possibility for developing an ambitious roadmap and a very concrete program for implementing with the different pilots the concrete real transformation of our urban lifestyles based on this concept, resilience for a happy proximity.
Thank you. And Rit, a final word from you, what you hope for from the summit and what our audience should look for next in New York.
Well, I think in terms of the summit, I would say one of the things that these are opportunities to be really precise. What do cities have a common need for from the higher levels of government? One thing we are facing in New York, and I think it's true for many cities around the United States, is we're going to struggle to get our fair share of all of the federal money from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act. Because even and it's understood that this is a red state, blue city problem. So Texas is kind of politically looking out to, keep Houston and Austin from getting too much money. But even in a blue state like New York, the state imposes funding restrictions that ensure that New York City never gets its fair share of money. So we are 44% of the state, 59% of the state's disadvantaged populations. Usually we get a quarter or 10% or 6% of given pots of money. And we need the federal government to address that. And I think that's the kind of very specific ask that if we see a pattern of cities across the United States and across the Americas having those kinds of problems, or if there are countries that have done really good funding formulas that we can emulate, that would be a great thing to come out.
There you have it, the final word, and we're just about out of time. I want to thank the audience for coming, especially thank our speakers, Erin, Carlos, and Rit, for joining us today. Look ahead to the summit next week and come back next time for the Carnegie Endowments events. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you for the kind invitation. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Rohit, Erin, bye-bye.
Take care.